Welcome to the We're Doing It Wrong podcast, a production of WDIW Media, hosted by Joseph Pazar and also today David Michael Slater, and inspired by David's book, We're Doing It Wrong, 25 Ideas in Education That Just Don't Work and How to Fix Them. Today, David and I co-host a conversation with Tom Vander Ark. Before I introduce Tom, just a quick programming note. Next week, you'll hear from Nevada State School Board member David Carter. I found it very interesting to get in the mind of a politician whose work entirely revolves around education. And then the following week, you'll hear from Michael Linson. Just had a great conversation with him, and his work is pretty extensive in the area of classroom management. So we talk extensively about that, along with his latest book, which I can't recommend enough. So good things to come in the following weeks. But back to today. David and I have a conversation with Tom Vander Ark. And again, these are just meant to be conversations. We do prepare, but you are hearing us learn in real time. So Tom is an advocate for innovations in learning. He's the CEO of Getting Smart, and he's advised school districts and networks, education foundations and funders, impact organizations on how to move forward. He's a prolific writer and speaker. Tom is author of Better Together, Getting Smart, Smart Cities, and Smart Parents. He has published thousands of articles, co-authored more than 50 books and white papers, and he writes regularly on GettingSmart.com, Education Week, Forbes, and LinkedIn. And GettingSmart.com is really a great website. It's a wealth of resources. So if you're not following Tom Vander Ark's work on GettingSmart.com or some of the other writers there, I suggest you do that, of course, along with our website. Tom received the Distinguished Achievement Medal and graduated from the Colorado School of Mines. He earned an MBA in finance from the University of Denver and continues his education online. He served as the first executive director of education for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He has also served as a public school superintendent, and his CV goes on because he's done a lot of very interesting things in education. So without further ado, I bring you our conversation with Tom Vander Ark. Today I'm here with David Michael Slater, and together we are talking with Tom Vander Ark. Tom, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, great to be with you guys.
You know, last week I was speaking with Greg Smith about place-based education, and after our conversation, you were one of the first people he said I should get in touch with. Little did he know we already had something calendared, so we really appreciate you coming on.
I'm a big fan of Greg's, and we're both advisors to Teton Science School, really the best in class network when it comes to learning outdoors, but they're also in a spectacular place to learn outdoors.
Yes, Tom, welcome. Greg was one of my professors when I did my master's at Lewis and Clark, so small world.
Oh, and because you're a P&W guy, you went to school here in the Pacific Northwest, and you were in Beaverton for a long time, right?
I was, yes.
That's great.
Well, let me get us kicked off. Your website is just phenomenal, and you seem like you're doing the work of 10 men, and that there's pretty much no education-related subjects that are not in there. So we were thinking maybe you could start by telling us about your Getting Smart organization and what its mission is and how it came about.
We focus on innovations in learning. My wife and youngest daughter started it 10 years ago when I launched what is now Learn Capital with a group. We were in San Diego, and Karen was looking to provide advocacy and advisory services, mostly to ed tech firms, and I helped out as I could in the first few years, and then wound down my activity at Learn Capital and joined full time at what became Getting Smart about 8 years ago, and then we hired our oldest daughter Caroline to run the place, and so we've been working together for almost 8 years, focusing on innovations in learning. We focus primarily on K-12, but try in our practice and in our website to include early learning all the way through job training, so that we're really aware of, broadly speaking, of how humans develop and what is new and important in that category. We're most interested in powerful learning experiences for young people. So we've already talked a little bit about place-based education. We're leading advocates for project-based learning. We think that's uniquely important these days, that students have at least some extended challenges that make up part of their school year. We always look for interesting ways that technology can play a useful role for both teachers and for students. And so that's really the core of our work. We have about a dozen people. We're located in the Seattle area, but our practice leads in school design and advocacy and advisory are scattered around the country.
So you've got a family business going there. Was it generated on their behalf because disappointment with their own education, your daughter anyway?
I would say that my wife and daughters all have communications background. So it initially was looking for ways to help schools and school-related enterprises do a better job of getting the word out. I would say that both of my daughters went to the schools where I was superintendent in the 90s, and were quite pleased with elementary through middle school and quite disappointed with their high school experience. And so they both, I guess their dad helped them engineer rapid pathways through high school that incorporated dual enrollment and early graduation. And high school has, it's interesting that high school has been the focus of my work for 30 years, in part because of my own frustration as a public school superintendent and not being able to improve the high schools that we have or start new and innovative high schools as quickly as I wanted. But then the real important story, I think, happened when I began helping Bill and Melinda with their philanthropy in 1999. And I left the school district and I attended my older daughter's graduation as a parent, and sat in the Tacoma Dome and watched her and 400 students come into the stadium. And I leaned over and I said to my wife, I sent more kids to that school than are in blue robes. And I actually counted them. And I leaned over and I said, I sent 600 middle school kids to that school, and there's only 400 on the stage. What happened to the other 200? Mm-hmm. And as crazy as that sounds, it was the first time that I actually realized the dramatic, in that case, visual dropout problem that we had. And so I quickly did some math, and it turns out that the same was happening around the state of Washington, and that 2/3 number was pretty close to the national average, even though we were reporting rates that were much, much higher. And it was that story that really launched my crusade at the Gates Foundation to try to dramatically increase the percentage of American kids that graduated from high school ready for college and careers.
And what were you mentioned dual enrollment and early graduation. Were those your primary attacks on that problem?
No, the primary attacks were rigor, relevance, and relationship. That's a phrase that I borrowed from Elliot Washer and Doc Littke, the founders of the Big Picture Learning. When I helped Bill and Melinda launch what became the Gates Foundation in '99. Bill told me to take 6 months and visit schools and come back and tell them what we should do. And I visited over 500 schools in 1999, and it really opened my eyes to a completely different approach to education. High schools that looked and worked very different, that were very student centered. Schools where students were doing authentic work, often community connected work, where they were developing public products, where the focus was on performance assessments rather than standardized tests. I was learning from Debbie Meyer and Ted Sizer, as well as the guys that started Big Picture. I visited all the early expeditionary learning schools, all the alternative schools in New York City. And so that fall of '99 and those visits really had a big impact on my view on what high school could be, that we could make high school a much more personalized experience, one where it was focused on sustained adult relationships and real and important work, and that I think those proved to be the keys to dramatically increasing American graduation rates and the percentage of students that leave with a better sense of who they are and what they want to do in the world.
Let me squeeze in one more question. I think we want to talk a ton about the things you just mentioned, but since you're bringing up raising high school graduation rates, I'm sure you're aware there's pressure everywhere on high schools to improve that. And sometimes, let me just give you an example in our district. The way they do it is a little bit baffling. We have a school that has just decreed that, well, they don't specifically say this is a plan to raise graduation rates. That's what it seems to me. They have just decreed that students who do not turn in an assignment will be given a 50% on it. Have you heard of anything like this before?
No, that it's an odd policy solution. You and I have both written a lot about the shift to competency, and I do think rather than just quote failing a subject or failing a test, that our attitude ought to be not yet, right? That you haven't mastered it yet, and we're going to create the time and the support that you need to find a way to help you succeed. So I do appreciate that approach, but like an automatic 50 is bizarro.
Yeah. Okay. I just mentioned it because, not specifically to call out that program. I think that
well,
you're advocating for the harder path, and it seems like pressure is making some schools take different paths.
Well, David, I get, I'm circumspect now that I'm almost 60, and I look back 30 years ago, and I wanted all kids to have access to the high schools where they would do powerful community connected learning, and simultaneously I was helping to support the beginning of what became No Child Left Behind, and believe very strongly that adding measurement to the system would help us build equity into the system, and recognize where we weren't serving kids well. And I thought these two ideas of authentic learning and measurement should live together simultaneously. And we three of us have all seen the bizarre ways that's gone off the rails, right?
Yeah, actually, could you speak to that a bit, since you were involved with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and No Child Left Behind? What is your view on our current situation with regard to standardized testing, and what is it at odds with your initial vision?
Yeah, I came out of the retail business, and so in 1993, I was a senior VP for a national Costco competitor, and every day I had the sales by item by store. I knew our customers really, really well, and remember, this is like 30 years ago, and And then I moved into, I was the first business guy to try to be a school superintendent. And when I got to our district, we didn't know anything about anything. I couldn't tell you how many kids were in school. I didn't know anything about my teachers. I didn't know which schools were doing well or not doing well. How many kids are reading and writing. Um, we just didn't have any information about anything. It was like flying blind. It was completely disconcerting. And so when our state introduced standards and then assessments in my first year, I really embraced that and went directly to standards-based grading, and really tried to use the new state test for all that they could tell us about students. But fast forward 10 and now more than 20 years, and we've seen lots of unintended consequences where administrators have become very focused on just producing better standardized test results. And we forgot a lot about what we knew about a great education. And so it's obviously in many schools, if not most, had a really damaging effect um, on the quality of education. Uh, but it is simultaneously, I think, help from an equity standpoint, because American education will never be the same. We will always think about groups of kids and whether they're being adequately served, and so it's had an important equity benefit. The path forward is to use measurement, I think, more smartly. Um, why I'm excited about technology is that we can see assessment move into the background, that we can collect lots of information about a student's progress. We can provide that feedback to students and teachers to help inform their path forward. But we're clearly at a point where we're at the beginning of the end of standardized testing, where we take a week off and assume that we don't know anything about a student, and provide this battery of tests to know how they're doing. Good schools know how every student is doing in every subject every day, and don't need to take a week off of school. We just need to build ways to for that to be shared accurately and comparably. And I think we're only a couple of years away from being able to do that.
That's something I've been pondering for a bit of time. As the modes of learning increasingly become based in technology, will we end up with, basically smart enough systems within the technology to give us good assessment data as students are learning? Is that what you mean by the beginning of the end of standardized testing, where we take a week
Yes.
off? So it's kind of embedded in the actual process, the active assessment?
Yes. And so what we need we need interoperability, because right now, you think about the average fifth grader in America, they get 5 kinds of feedback. They're taking a Dreambox adaptive learning system. They may do some digital curriculum that has some embedded assessments. They do a worksheet from their teacher, maybe a performance task that's scored. They may have some scored homework. They go home and they do some Khan Academy and they're getting a score. They stop and they take a MAPS test that's an adaptive periodic assessment. The problem is we don't have a good way to combine those half a dozen sources of data. Um, and I think when we can combine that data and surface it in a simple data visualization, we'll have pretty accurate information about the student's level of learning and their sort of vector, how quickly they're growing, and that will allow students and teachers to co-construct learning journeys going forward that are really informed in real time by data.
Is that synonymous with competency-based learning, or is there a difference there? Or basically, does that term encompass everything you're talking about, where we're moving?
Yeah, great question. And currently, there are a number of different definitions of competency-based. I narrow it down to two things: show what you know and progress on mastery. So if a student's progress is based on their demonstrated mastery, that to me is competency-based. And it really does unlock the potential for a fully personalized pathway, both in terms of how students are learning, but also the pacing of their learning.
Let me throw in a question there. I just want to make an observation and get your opinion on it. Doesn't it seem odd that we need a concept called competency-based learning? Like, how did we reach the point where someone had to invent that term?
Yeah, the whole idea of grades over the last 100 years have become uh, uh, sort of bizarre and perverse, and the fact that we organize schools around age cohorts and push them through a standardized curriculum, and some kids get it and some kids don't, but we just keep marching them on, uh, producing and leaving big learning gaps for many students that are, ultimately never identified and remediated. So it's a crazy flaw in the basic design of schooling that's perpetuated for hundreds of years. And I think this is one of the common sense of things that Saul Kahn has said, that it's like building a house on sand, and a bad foundation is just going to create all sorts of problems in the future. So mastery-based learning really does require that you demonstrate mastery at a high level, and it prevents gaps, particularly in these basic skills of reading, writing, and problem solving, that prevent future success. So that's an important difference between competency-based learning and the way that we've organized education for more than 100 years.
Right. So wouldn't a lot of people, they hear the concept and it's really hard to argue with, but it implies, doesn't it, that you have to be willing to not push kids forward who can't demonstrate basic competency, and then you have to deal with those implications.
Yeah, it does. And some smart people built this thing called response to intervention, RTI, as a way within the age constructed school system that we have to make a good faith effort to try to get kids back on track. Um, and I think pacing is important. There are some benefits to kids moving with kids in their age group, but it really is important, particularly in core skills like reading, writing, and math, that we help all kids succeed at a high level. And if that means you need more time and support, then we should deliver that, rather than moving kids on in a lockstep school. And we're really excited that there are so many schools that are becoming more nimble. I was in Lindsay, California recently, where they're adding more and more multi-age classrooms, and where kids move quite seamlessly in reading, writing, and math groups, rather than being locked into a single class and moving with kids of their same age. So we're starting to see mechanisms and tools built that are more dynamic in nature, but it's frustrating for educators because the basic learning platforms, grade books, and even school buildings are all constructed around the premise of an age cohort.
And would you say, and I'm not sure if you would agree with this or not, but it seems to me there might be a little bit of an elephant in the room for maybe broader society, or at least this pervasive belief that, students come to school primarily all the same, and there really are no differences in ability or, background, or to the extent at which those differences exist, they can be leveled out at school within any given year. And so at least that's from my observation. I go, well, what underlying belief system would cause one to group kids by age and just move them along really regardless of the learning they attained? I'm wondering if
Well,
you would agree with that or not.
Yeah, I guess it was just the simple industrial era organizing principle that we sort of locked in with the standards movement of the last 25 years. I think folks like Todd Rose have been helpful reminding us that we're all really, really different. And, anybody that's had kids can't help but remark on how remarkably different they are, even though they share the same gene pool and grew up in the same house. They're just remarkably different human beings, and we seem to forget that when we throw kids into a room because they all happen to have a birthday in the same calendar year.
Well, on the flip side of that, there seems to be a movement that teachers should be able to accommodate to 35 or 40 completely different kids and their individual needs in a single classroom. What do you think?
Well, it's an impossible job. I just visited the Albemarle Public Schools in Virginia, and they're adding all these beautiful multi-age spaces to their elementary schools where there's like 6 big classrooms combined around a set of resources. And a space like that with so many different learning spaces and so many learning professionals that share the pastoral care for a group of students. Students can move easily from group to group and teacher to specialist. I think that sort of an environment makes it much easier to support really personalized pathways.
Well, it's amazing to get your experience. It's we don't hear about all these great things, so it's wonderful to hear that amazing things are happening. I know you did a little feature on the Acton Academy, where maybe you can explain that there are cases where the teacher's not even around for days at a time.
Acton Academy is a small private school in Austin, created by Jeff and Laura Sandifer. They created it for their own kids, and now they have about 100 schools around the world that have joined them in this what they call a learner-driven community. It's not a free-for-all. That sometimes when people visit a Montessori school, it does feel like a free-for-all. They have very clear learning goals and actually have quite well engineered projects for students at Acton Academy, but it is a very learner-driven environment. The high school students help the middle school students with goal setting and goal monitoring. The middle school students help the elementary students with goal setting and goal monitoring. And so there's a lot of peer learning and peer monitoring that's happening. The last time I visited Acton in Austin, it was I think a Wednesday when I visited the middle school, and I think I was the first adult to set foot into their middle school classroom, and everybody there was hard at work at a smart cities project where small teams of students were building components for our smart city. These city grids all had to snap together, and the electrical and mechanical systems all had to work together. So you not only had to build a working unit of a city in your team, that team had to work together with the entire middle school group to build a working model. So it was. I don't know. To me, it looked like graduate level project being directed by middle school students um, with some direction from high school students that had done a similar project before. So yeah, it was an extraordinary thing. But for me, a great example of a well-constructed task, an extended challenge, um, an environment set up to give and get feedback on a regular basis, and a recognition that middle school students could manage themselves in and relatively complicated work for extended periods of time.
And we would be absolutely remiss to not pick your brain about smart cities. So that's a topic we definitely want to just briefly touch on. But before we move there, I want to ask how you think some of this or some of these movements and ideas are permeating the college world. And recently, I think it was in June, you wrote an article about, or I think it was entitled "Imagining a Blockchain University." And prior to stumbling across your article, I had just been complaining to some friends about the lack of flexibility still with a lot of formalized college options. You can almost learn anything you want to learn now through varied means,
Right.
Online Harvard courses and such, but they're not formalized. So I was hoping you could kind of define what a blockchain is. What is this concept, and then how might that transform post K-12 learning?
I let's say secondary and post-secondary particularly.
Hmm.
So blockchain's a distributed ledger technology. Think of a bank today as a third-party information manager. They manage information about you and your money, and we trust them to manage that information as well as our assets. In a distributed ledger, rather than asking a third party to manage it, we make a transaction, and then a record of that transaction is spread across the network so that hundreds, thousands, or millions of computers all get a copy of that transaction. So it's a shared ledger of transactions that creates this immutable uh, ledger and powers decentralized systems. So how and where will that be useful in education? I'll pick two areas that I think are going to be the most important. The first that this Wolf University focuses on. This is a group of academics at Oxford in England. They're banking on the fact that smart contracts will radically reduce the cost of administering a university. So a smart contract means that when a community comes together on a distributed ledger and agrees that when a set of conditions has been met, that a smart contract can be executed. And so in this case, if a class is attended or if mastery is demonstrated in a way that has been agreed upon in this community, then a credit can be issued. So this is an example of how the administration of time and attendance and issuing credits could be done uh, much more efficiently than has been done in the past. The second application that I'll talk about is a transcript. And in this brave new world where we can learn anything almost anywhere, what learners will be able to do is assemble evidence from multiple providers and assemble it in their own uh, transcript, which could very well be in a distributed ledger technology like blockchain. And so learners will be able to assemble evidence of learning from many, many different sources. Those forms of evidence will be recognized by a community. In other words, you won't be able to fake a transcript and say, I went to the University of North Carolina. You will only be able to incorporate verified forms of evidence into your transcript. And that's going to make it much easier for learners to assemble evidence of learning from many, many different sources. All of those are going to power what Ryan Craig talks about in his new book, A New You, faster and cheaper forms of secondary and post-secondary learning.
This seems to me, I mean, this patently seems to be the future, right? This meets the needs of so many people across the country who might be, they just don't have the resources to go to a brick and mortar universities. But I have to ask, what do you envision with regard to who makes the decisions on what's acceptable and what's not? Would this be a committee comprised of really all stakeholders, or would it be like a centralized accreditation agency like you might have now that goes in and accredits colleges?
So that's the key question. Let's talk about the Mastery Transcript Consortium. This is an association of the 200 leading independent schools in America. They're creating a new transcript. You can learn more about it at mastery.org, or see a couple of the articles and podcasts that we've posted on Getting Smart. It was organized around the premise that schools should be able to determine what graduates should know and be able to do, and the forms of evidence that they will accept. That idea that every single school should identify competencies and forms of evidence seems unwieldy to me, and we think rather what will become much more prevalent is groups of schools that join, I call them diploma networks of schools that share a common set of outcomes, a common learning model, often some platform tools, and diplomas from those networks we think will become widely recognized. And eventually, I think states will just affiliate with a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen diploma networks rather than issuing their own graduation guidelines and administering their own tests. So your question's the right one. Who decides what competencies are important? I think we'll see an aggregation of the answer to that question. In the past, it was guided by states defining graduation requirements. I think in the future, it will be defined more commonly by diploma networks seeking to serve a specific purpose. Think International Baccalaureate as an example today of an internationally recognized standard of excellence. It's both a set of learning outcomes as well as curriculum and assessments. It today is the biggest and best example of a diploma network, but I think we'll see many like that in the future, and a growing number of them that are specifically aiming at career and technical education, at specific job clusters.
As you were saying that, I was thinking exactly like this will become completely acceptable, this is my thought anyway, the day that Apple looks at some kid's transcript, computer science transcript that never attended a single university, and says, we know this, you're hired.
Well, it's already happening. Google has already moved away from the reliance on pedigree of where you got your degree and what your SAT was, and they're moving much more to demonstrated competence. So I think we're well on our way. It's not going to be an overnight shift, but we're already seeing we haven't talked about artificial intelligence, but it's really going to be the combination of blockchain and artificial intelligence that I think are really profound in shaping the sort of human development sector. Because when each of us has a comprehensive learner record that includes evidence from multiple sources as well as a portfolio of artifacts, and when a machine learning algorithm can, in a millisecond, look at the thousands of articles that I've written, for example, and make a very quick judgment about my general writing ability, and combine that with what other sources can tell them about my capabilities, then we'll be able to make hiring judgments that are based on demonstrated mastery rather than pedigree.
And I may be mistaken, but I think I stumbled across an Elon Musk tweet the other day that alluded to the fact that college degrees are overrated in the hiring process. So it does seem as though these major and innovative companies are moving strongly in this direction. And it strikes me as though if there was one move that education was to make, this would be the move to make. And I can't help but think that this, ties perfectly into our prior conversation on sort of distributed learning in the K-12 sphere. And if this actually does occur, two questions: will the role of the teacher be radically redefined? And, if so, what does that mean for the role of teachers and how teachers are evaluated?
It will, and I guess is radically redefining the role of the teacher. Now that we've all been augmented, now that we're all walking around with early forms of artificial intelligence in our pocket, it clearly redefines the role of the teacher. In many ways, I think it makes the role of the teacher more important. I'll go back to my opening comments about the importance of sustained adult relationships. I think now that we're all connected, the biggest divide is the guidance divide. Young people that have caring adults at home and at school just have an extraordinary benefit, an extraordinary advantage over young people that don't have those kind of relationships. What's becoming clear is that we have a new set of learning priorities in this innovation economy. First of all, we need young people that have design skills that can walk into complexity with confidence. We need enterprise entrepreneurial skills, people that can spot opportunity and deliver value. And then third, we need extraordinary social emotional skills, the ability to understand yourself and to read social situations, to manage collaboration, to be able to work on a diverse team. And to develop all three of those, I think the role of the teacher is very, very important. It's no longer a role of delivering content because there's a lot of much more efficient ways to do that. But I think the relational side, the guidance and advice side of the role have never been more important and will continue to become more important. And to the point of evaluation, we need to recognize the new roles that the teachers are playing and make sure that it's appropriately valued.
Did you see the recent Gates report? Trying to look for it. I have a copy of it somewhere. That basically said that they focused too heavily on teacher evaluation as the critical component to improving student outcomes, and now they think that they've overlooked important things like the kid's background and the support and the relations that you're talking about. Did you see that? Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
What do you think? And I found it. Brian Stetcher, lead author of the Gates Foundation. He said that adding factors like early childhood education, family support, and child nutrition also need to be addressed to make a significant impact on student performance.
Well, in the same way that we as a country sort of locked in on standardized tests, we locked in on teacher eval, and when you lock in on a few weak proxies for performance, whether it's teachers or students, and it has a way of having terrible unintended consequences. So the teacher evaluation work was well intentioned, and it was necessary. I think most schools were not. If we go back 15 years ago to the beginning of this, 20 years ago now, we're not doing a good job of evaluating their teachers. I found that to be true in the school district where I was superintendent as well. And so it was obviously important to build a new performance coaching, performance feedback system. I think the reductionist approaches to that didn't work very well. It doesn't mean that it's not important. I think it's more important than ever that we get really clear about what good teachers know and can do, and that we help all teachers. I think teachers, like students, need a personalized and competency-based pathway that increasingly unlocks new levels of opportunity and compensation for them, and allows them to extend their impact from a few kids to thousands of kids. Talent development systems are more important than ever. This shouldn't be viewed as a repudiation of the need for really thoughtful talent development systems. It says that our early efforts were sort of myopic and not very well constructed, and there's a lot more work to do.
Do you think there needs to be an equal new approach to teacher training?
Yeah, teacher training in America is sort of disastrously bad. It's a haphazard collection of courses that have little to do with the real work. In short, networks of schools should come together to form agreements around the role that they see teachers play in their schools and networks, and they should provide those profiles to institutions of preparation that are interested in entering in a preparation partnership with them. And I think that it suggests a radically different, much more practice-oriented, much more clinical approach to preparation. I think you guys know that I just released a new book on school networks. I think it's really important for groups of like-minded schools to work together, and I think we will see much more network-specific preparation occur in the future. I think we're going to see many more versions of school, different conceptions of the kinds of learning experiences that young people and teachers should have. And a form of generic preparation just doesn't make sense anymore. I think a much higher percentage of preparation ought to be specific to the types of schools that a teacher wants to work in.
And are you referencing the book Better Together?
Yes.
Got it. We'll definitely put a link to that in this episode description.
I just got my copy last night. The premise is that personalized and project-based learning are really promising, but they're really difficult to execute, and we shouldn't assume that individual teachers or even individual schools should um, build and sustain their own approach. That there's benefits to working in informal or formal networks of schools.
On that note, this change that you're looking forward to, is it facilitated or harmed by the presence of the Federal Department of Education? Like, can that help,
Well,
or where's your stand on that?
they just don't have much of a role anymore. We just finished a 25-year period of time where the federal role was supersized. That led up to NCLB, and then you remember Race to the Top and I3 grants that were a big part of the ARRA, the Recovery Act. So that was like adding federal control. That was adding turbochargers to federal control. So we lived through kind of a weird period where the federal government had a lot of influence on American education, and we're back to the idiosyncratic American normal of state-driven education. So the federal government doesn't, in this country, play a terribly important role in education. I think they could play a useful sort of an R&D role. There's a few examples of where that has worked, but I don't pay much attention to it these days.
So this networking phenomenon that you're seeing starting, you think that's going to happen regardless of federal influence?
Yes.
So I really want to pick your brain before we close out on smart cities and AI in general, and those are huge topics. So, but I saw your recent I think it was, can't recall the network now, but TV interview, and you were referencing the Smart Cities Council three definitional items for a smart city: livability, sustainability, and workability, and you added the term learnability. So I'm curious, what does it mean to have learnability with regards to this concept of smart city, and what role does K-12 play in making a city high in learnability?
We wrote a book called Smart Cities That Work for Everyone, 7 Keys to Education and Employment a couple of years ago. That was the result of a 2-year study that we did on innovations in learning, cataloging the key innovations in America's great cities. And the key finding in our book, Smart Cities, is that cities need a learning ecosystem where the key players are working together to support kids and families and working adults. So K-12 plays a pivotal role in the basis of a smart city. One challenge in America is that in most metropolitan areas, that means many different school districts need to work together to support a metropolitan ecosystem. In some places that works really well, and in some places it doesn't. I'll mention a couple examples. I'm a big fan of the Grable Foundation in Pittsburgh has an initiative called Remake Learning, and that's a great example of a simple premise that all kids deserve powerful learning experiences that has united that region, including all the school districts and a couple hundred nonprofit organizations around this premise, and has really, I think, lit up, invigorated the learning in that region. It's encouraged the school districts to work together in more productive ways. It's really shared a vision for what powerful learning needs to look like for the future. So I think that is a good example. The Kauffman Foundation has worked hard to support a regional vision for across state lines in Kansas City. In the last year and a half, they've supported 300 people from Kansas City to visit about 60 schools in 12 different cities, just as an attempt to create a new picture of what good learning looks like and what is possible around America. I think that's going to lead to a new graduate profile. The League of Innovative Schools is 100 of the leading districts around America, and also EdLeader 21, now part of Battelle. Those are examples of districts that are holding community conversations about what graduates should know and be able to do. We think that's a key starting point for any smart city to begin those conversations across school districts about what the new learning priorities are, and then through collective action, often championed by the Strive network, gets everybody in the community, K-12, higher education, early learning, foundations, and the youth and family support organizations all moving in the same direction. I also saw this happening in Tulsa earlier this year behind the leadership of a group called Impact Tulsa. A great example of working across school districts with higher ed to align regional progress. So we think those are the key aspects of learnability, and we'd like to see every metro area make that a priority.
So I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't ask you a question about artificial intelligence and just honestly pursuing my own interest here, because it seems as though many of the ideas expressed are kind of predicated on this notion that artificial intelligence is here, it's here to stay, it's improving, quite rapidly, and it likely will lead to the decentralization of a lot of the systems that we care about. So I have to ask, do you share the concerns of the likes of Elon Musk and Sam Harris and those who see an immutable existential threat that maybe not immutable, so it's possibly addressable, but definitely something of grave concern? Or are you more like the Steven Pinkers of the world, where you're really just not too concerned about AI going awry for humanity?
I've been studying AI and the future of work initially with a Hewlett Foundation grant, and the report that I posted in December called "Ask About AI: The Future of Work and Learning" left me quite paradoxical. I think my answer is and both. I left both terrified by the existential threat. I guess I left most concerned about the inevitable income inequality. If we think people in the United States were ticked off in 2016 about income equality, just wait till 2020, 2018, 2020, 2024. AI, unlike blockchain, AI is a centralizing force. And powerful algorithms are going to drive wealth creation like that, which we've not seen. And it's going to come down to how we as communities and states and countries decide to share. And the United States is an idiosyncratic way of sharing. We lead the world in philanthropy. But I'm afraid that we are not well positioned to share the the enormous benefits that AI is going to produce. Here's the good news about AI. There's never been a better time to make a difference. And I want every school on the planet to be alive with that sense of possibility that we're not just preparing young people for jobs down the 15 years down the road. We want to engage them in making their communities better today. And we want to increasingly do that by helping them pick a cause that they care about, wrangling big data sets, applying open AI tools to those data sets, and helping them experience the contribution that they can make to their community today. It's never been easier to launch a business, to code an app, to create a campaign, or to use really powerful tools. And that makes it, in many ways, the most exciting time to ever be alive. Our kids have a chance to solve climate change, to to beat cancer, to create clean water, to create ubiquitous clean energy, and AI and machine learning are going to help solve all of those problems. But what we also need is the civic infrastructure to begin to address the really complicated questions that are coming head at us. So it is both a good news, bad news story.
Do you foresee a future where something like universal basic income is absolutely required? Because some of the work that we're going to want to get done as a society may not be always market viable, and in an area where lots of things are decentralized, but as you said, wealth is centralized with AI. Are we going to need to look at a drastic change with our economy and how we distribute wealth in something like
absolutely. Unquestionably, we'll need a much stronger social safety net. We'll need a new set of agreements that value teaching and caregiving, early learning, elder care, creativity, contributions to beautiful shared spaces. And so I wouldn't just limit it to an income protection schemes. I also think we need incentives for contribution to civic life. But all of those are going to require a new set of agreements. So civics has never been more important than ever. Every community needs the ability to create these new agreements that keep us moving forward.
Yeah, it's both exciting and terrifying, kind of that.
Simultaneously. I can't. I am clearly of both minds. I am super excited for the world my granddaughter will inherit, and sort of equally terrified. Throughout this conversation, we've talked repeatedly about the unintended consequences that have come from well-intentioned but poorly implemented initiatives, and it seems clear that we'll stumble. NCLB didn't work because it was a well-intentioned scheme that we just didn't apply agile government philosophy to. If we had iterated for 15 years, it's conceivable that we could have come up with a framework that actually worked. And every community is going to need that sort of an iterative approach to problem solving, or things are going to get ugly. So
yeah, and I think I would
it's
personally,
a great new world.
Yeah, and I would personally feel so much better about approaching this great new world if if we had our political act together in terms of dialing down the animosity, because these are both gonna, these are the things we're discussing are ethical, political, problems, and then they're going to require strong systems in both of those spheres to solve. But I can't tell you how thankful I am to speak with you, Tom. I'm now mindful of our time, but we definitely want to give you the last word. So is there anything else you want to mention? And if our listeners want to find out more about you, where should they go?
Well, it's never been more important that each of us remain a learner, and that we join communities of learners and look for ways that we can make a contribution to building the sort of systems of learning that our kids really deserve. I mean, that's what we try to write about on gettingsmart.com every day. And we'd invite you and your listeners to join us in that conversation. We're always looking for guest posts there, and try to engage in this conversation online in places like Twitter. I'm at T Vander Ark on Twitter. So look forward to connecting with you and your listeners online.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Tom. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, there are several ways you can support our work. First and foremost, you can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or just using our RSS feed. And giving us reviews helps more than you think. If you want to provide direct support, we have a support tab on our main page, we'redoingitwrong.com, that links to our Patreon account. Patreon's a neat system that allows you to pledge a dollar amount per episode produced and set a monthly maximum. So you only pay when you get new content you love. But most importantly, we just appreciate your listenership. Thank you.